You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. The boss of HMV has insisted that the chain still has a future on the British High Street. The major high street retailer called in administrators last week, soon after the photographic chain Jessops. But the third casualty since Christmas was the DVD rental firm Blockbuster. They announced this week that they'll close 129 of their 528 stores. But Trevor Moore says HMV can find a successful business outcome and remain on the high street. Facing a rise in consumers shopping online for the likes of photographic equipment, CDs, DVDs and games, and a shift to digital downloading, what is the future for the British High Street? Well, joining me for today's discussion is Andrew Harrison, the editor of the music publication Q Magazine. Mark Thompson is a Lib Dem blogger. Walaa Idris is a political activist. And joining us on the phone is Julian Dobson, a researcher specialising in urban regeneration. We'll begin with Andrew Harrison from Q Magazine. What went wrong for these high street retailers?
I think the one thing they've got in common is they've all been laid waste by digital. Music, games, even photography has all been impacted strongly by the internet and by broadband. Even the renting of movies now can take place from your little digital box. So they took a very bad hit from the expansion of digital services. But I think in HMV's case, there was also the problem that they kind of lost their faith in music. It became harder and harder to find records in a record shop. The CDs were stacked at the back.
Walaa Idris, what are your thoughts?
Well, I feel the reason, beside the digital innovation, they also refuse to really come with the times. Right now, if I just take my own personal experience, I don't have to go into a HMV or any kind of video or DVD shop to buy a DVD or a CD. I don't even buy CDs anymore. I download the song I like. Mm-hmm. Remember how we used to buy vinyls and CDs and just listen to one song or tape it over and over and listen to it somewhere else? Mm-hmm. We no longer use the big, the experience. We might moan the experience of going into a shop and having the shop assistant talk you through which song. But in reality, our lifestyles have changed.
I know what you mean about the experience not fitting, because HMV hasn't been a very lovely shopping experience when compared to things like coffee shops and clothing shops and stuff like that. But I do think that there's still a place for physical browsing in people's repertoire. I don't like to just sit at a computer all day. Somebody described to me that listening to iTunes is like listening to a spreadsheet. It kind of lacked spirit. It lacked that soul that you get in a record shop. So I do think
Mark
it's something
Thompson,
we'll
let's bring you in here, a Liberal Democrat blogger. What are your thoughts about, is iTunes like listening to a spreadsheet? What went wrong for HMV?
I think in the case of HMV in particular, I think it's actually quite tragic, because they could have been in the vanguard of these download services and these purchases online. They had a very strong brand that had been around for a number of years. If you think kind of 15 years ago, most people had never heard of Amazon. Obviously now it's ubiquitous, but back then HMV could really have leveraged the brand identity that they had and really pushed things online. But they completely missed the boat. I've read quotes from, senior executives in HMV 5 or 10 years ago saying that, digital downloads aren't really going to get much traction. People are always going to want the physical experience of going into a shop. And I just don't agree. And I just come into what Andrew was saying about the browsing experience and the chancing upon different music that you may not otherwise have come across. I'm not sure I agree with that, because you have things like on Amazon where you'll see people that have bought this record also bought these other records. And you get things like Spotify where you can see what friends of yours on Twitter or Facebook are listening to at the moment, so you can pick up on what other people are listening to. And actually that's something you couldn't do with CDs and records. Okay, you could speak to your friends and find out, but instantly being able to see on like their Facebook page or the Twitter timeline what people are listening to and thinking, oh, that sounds quite interesting, I'll go and have a listen to that. I mean, I think I think the digital sphere has actually massively widened our potential experiences, and I think it's a real shame that places like HMV just haven't embraced that.
And Julian Dobson, Urban Regeneration Specialist, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're seeing something very interesting going on, which is about a fragmentation of the market, really, and a fragmentation of ways of browsing music, listening to music, and also using the physical space. So on HMV in particular, I think their business model really was obsolete. They were trying to do stuff that could be done just as well online. If you look at the physical stores that are really, I think, have a future and have a niche, it's the independents. At the places where you can get that almost old-fashioned experience of going in and discovering that serendipity that Andrew was referring to. But I think that is going to be a very small section of the music market, and it's going to need a lot less physical space. Now, there are particular problems facing independent stores and small businesses, which maybe we can touch on later. But I think there's always going to be a place for them. I think the other thing that's very interesting that's going on at the moment, which is again digitally driven, is the reconnection of producers and consumers, where music makers are actually going directly to their audience through facilities such as Bandcamp. So you're actually seeing a much more direct engagement between the bands and those who want to listen to them. And then that's being spread via the digital tools such as Spotify.
Sure. Let's bring Andrew Harrison here, editor of Q Magazine.
I think that's really interesting. The Bandcamp model where you deal directly with your fans is an interesting thing. However, it's very much for the hardcore music fan, the person who's obsessed, the person like me, basically. The same with the small independent record shop. I mean, I live in East London. Small independent record shops are popping up like flowers in springtime. They're having a great time. But the problem is not with the real fan-based stuff. It's with the mid-markets. We have a very healthy, small-scale record shop culture, and we have supermarkets selling mainstream releases by the ton as loss leaders. What you don't have is that mid-range for the person for whom popping into a record shop every once a month is an opportunity to just dip your toe in the water and try something. If you want to buy a big smash pop hit very cheaply, the supermarket is great. If you want to delve into the absolute depths of music, your local independent record shop is probably in better shape now than it's been in the past 10 years. But the mid-range thing, where you might just pop in and buy a couple of CDs on impulse and maybe some birthday presents, that's the area that's kind of dying out.
Yeah, we've seen people buying now singles, and as we heard from Walaa earlier, whereas people used to go in and buy the whole album, people are now saying, I love that single, I won't buy the album.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the case. I can remember my granddad telling me in the 1970s, what do you buy albums for? One track you want and a load of filler. And I like to think that my granddad invented iTunes there and then. He saw the future. And it is true. Unbundling, as it's known, dismantling the album, buying the track you want, is absolutely a step forward. That's great. But I do think that people's music buying is kind of, it's not uniform. We don't want to just have one mode of purchasing. We don't want to just have only the option of Amazon if we want to buy a CD, or only the option of iTunes if we want to buy an individual track. We want to be able to shop in different ways. And I think one of the elephants in the room on this one is the fact that HMV was a British-based company. It paid its taxes. It had bricks and mortar. It couldn't be moved off the high street. It's in competition with large supranational organisations based in very tax-advantageous places. There is a reason.
We can't just put it down to their tax status.
I think that's a large part of it.
I think that's a little bit of a red herring. I mean, I take the point that there are companies out there who probably aren't paying as much tax as we'd like, for example. Mm-hmm. But I do think that it is unrealistic to think that in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time we were still going to have shops on the high street that we're involved with physical items that have to be packaged up, that have to be shipped to warehouses, that have to be shipped to high streets, that the high street shops are then staffed by, in some cases with the big stores, dozens of people, that they have to pay massively sky-high rents for these city centre and town centre locations. It is just unsustainable. And I agree, it's sad. I mean, I can't remember the last time I bought something from HMV, if I'm totally honest. But if I go shopping with my wife, then it's somewhere I'll go in and I'll browse. But I'll be honest with you, I go in, I have a look, and I think, oh, that looks good, that looks good, that looks good, and then I go and get them online later on. And I think a lot of people do that.
True. And people
I think there's an issue there about these this mid-range of music buying. And I think the issue is that it is not sustainable on the high street. And one of the reasons for that is the costs in terms of rents. One of the reasons is the convenience in terms of being able to download digitally. And I think iTunes has really filled that mid-market gap. And I think the other thing, which Andrew just touched on, is actually tax, but not in the way that was referred to. It's actually business rates, which are a huge disadvantage for high street operators. I mean, if the Amazon fulfillment centre in Doncaster pays business rates of £44 per square foot on its premises. Now, if you are opening a small shop unit in somewhere like Rochdale in a cheap area, you're going to pay about £1,000 per square foot in business rates. So clearly there is a disadvantage beyond just the rent you pay for the bricks and mortar, beyond the staff payments. There's a clear disadvantage in tax terms of being on the high street.
Do you think that high street shops should, although they do have their overheads, a lot of the problem is the price, where you can get it online for a lot cheaper? Is it not time for some of those high street shops to adapt their pricing?
Well, the problem is that their overheads are a lot higher, so that their margins are going to be a lot smaller. So it's easy to say, adapt your pricing, but actually, if you can't pay your bills through what you sell, you're out of business.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. Joining me for today's discussion is Andrew Harrison, the editor of Q Magazine. Walaa Idris is a political activist. Mark Thompson is a Lib Dem blogger. And Julian Dobson is an urban regeneration specialist. So, Walaa, do you think that the government then has let down high street businesses?
No,
not necessarily the Conservatives, but maybe previous ones.
I'm not talking about this government or any government for that matter. I am very much pro small government, as small as possible, and as meddling as less as possible. And I am all pro tax, giving, people, let people invest in their businesses and invest in how they can develop things.
How
further.
Can they if landlords are charging really high rents to independent and small businesses?
Well, they need to be creative somehow and find ways. There are a lot of small businesses are working either from home. A lot of people are working. You need to work with what you have. The idea that governments have to come in and fix stuff is ridiculous, and it is ludicrous. If you work with what you have, you will force those who overcharge you to change their prices. I cannot rent from the same person continuously and moan and ask and expect that the government to subsidize it for me, and then expect the person to change their way. If I walk away and find another way of doing things differently, then the person who's renting me at a very exorbitant amount will have to come down. The other thing also I was going to say, we keep forgetting the fact that the way we shop today is highly convenient. Imagine having to get out of bed, put on your clothes, drag the kids, get in the car, go to the high street, park, pay for the meter, look for the parking space, and then have to go to the shop and queue up. When you can do all this with a cup of tea in front of your computer and just get something in 2 seconds.
And I agree with that.
Enjoy it there and then.
That's absolutely true. And I do that myself. I mean, I bought the David Bowie single in bed before I'd even got up and had my cup of tea. However, shopping is also a leisure activity. You see it in all the big shopping centres around Britain. You see people going shopping because they enjoy it, and certain sectors, clothing, I mean, the coffee shop world is entirely an experience-based thing. The retailers that do it well make shopping a pleasurable experience, and I totally see the tax point, and there's a reason why record shops are popping up in East London where I live. The rents and the rates are cheap. However, destination shopping on places like Oxford Street in London can be made into a pleasurable experience if you don't turn it into a stack it high, sell it cheap warehouse.
Julian Dobson, you wanted to come in here.
What's going to happen, though, to the ordinary town centres and high streets in the UK, because there are going to be a relatively small number of destination shopping centres. And what we're seeing with all the big chains is even the ones that are not in financial difficulties are reducing the physical space that they have. So not only do you need to start thinking about how can you best improve the retail experience in that town centre. You need to think about how are we actually going to change those town centres so they provide things that people do need and are useful to them. And I think we need to start thinking of town centres really much more as social centres, much more as cultural centres, much less as retail centres. And then you'll start to get retail markets around that are relevant to the activities that people actually want to take part in.
Let's just bring in Mark Thompson here. How do you think we can make the high street more enjoyable? Because, you get in the car, you've got to struggle to find parking, then you have to pay for parking. And as we've heard from Walaa and Andrew, you can have the convenience of doing it in bed with a cup of tea in your pyjamas.
And I don't think that's really going to be solved. The internet isn't going to be uninvented. It is there. Most people use it, and it is in many ways.
But we can make the high street more attractive, couldn't we?
Possibly, but I'm a little bit with Walaa on this. I don't really think it's government's place or even necessarily local council's place to decide what's going to happen with town centres. I think to an extent we're going to have to wait and see. Politicians don't like saying this sort of thing. That's why I'm quite lucky I'm not a politician. I can say it. In 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, I don't think we can know what the high street's going to look like. I mean, a little vignette here. I a few months ago, started to notice in a couple of town centres that I was in that you're starting to get these pop-up shops. So they're just there for a few weeks, maybe like selling fireworks or selling Christmas stuff or even maybe, like record shops or gifts or something. There's just, someone's had an idea, they've got some stock and they move in. They sell the stock and a few weeks later they're out of there and, maybe the shop's vacant again or maybe another pop-up shop will move in. And that's a new innovation. And I suspect the reason why that's happened is not because government or local council have particularly planned it. I suspect what's happened is that the rents are too high, people have moved out, the landlords aren't willing to reduce the rent, so the places are left vacant, and that gives the people who want to set up these pop-up shops huge leverage to go in and say, well, you're not getting any money for it at the moment. We'll give you some money, but we're only going to be in for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and then we'll be out of there. And the landlords kind of don't have a choice. They'll have to say yes. So that's just one idea of what can happen.
By government and by local government. There have actually been attempts for about 3 or 4 years by central government to encourage this sort of thing. Yes, there have been lots of local activities, but actually trying to shift the mindset of landlords to allow pop-up shops and temporary uses has been like wading through treacle.
But what I'm saying, Julian, is that in the end, it's the market that's going to make that happen. Because if the landlords can't rent their shops out to businesses that are going to be in for many years at the rates that they want, then eventually they're going to be forced to. So I'm glad
isn't making that happen, because a lot of property is owned by landlords who have no connection with the place at all and don't actually care particularly whether this shop or that shop is full or empty. It's things like empty property rates, which are set by local government, that actually act as a lever to get landlords moving. So I think this idea that the market will just sort itself out, actually what you will have if you allow that sort of philosophy to take root is a huge amount of empty space, a huge amount of blight, and then eventually something new emerging from that. Now,
let's bring in Walaa Idris. What do you think about that?
Kind of
Julian, we're just going to go to Walaa Idris here. What are your thoughts?
I actually think the market, if you look at our history so far, the market more or less took care of itself. But I see where you're coming from. I can't understand any landlord or any shop owner or any property owner having a property, investing all that amount of money in it and just not caring what's going to happen to it. Market forces will force landowners and shop owners and property owners to change their way, but it might take longer than we like. It is still a better solution. It is a more organic solution to the problem than having laws on top of laws on top of laws, forcing people to do things they neither don't want to do or can't understand.
Andrew Harrison.
Well, it's all, I find your faith in market forces is wonderful and rather touching, but my experience on the high street round our way is that perfectly worthwhile shops are simply replaced with betting shops, with payday loan companies, with businesses that don't contribute anything to the area. Now, market forces have brought them in and they're cheap cheaper, and they're the places that can afford to be there. But it's not helping out in any way to regenerate those high streets, making them into places that you'd want to visit.
I think there's two different things there, though, Andrew, to be fair, because we've got, obviously, at the moment, a terrible economic situation. That's been the case since 2007. Of course, payday loan shops are going to move in. Of course, betting shops are going to move in. Of course, the kind of shops that, are looking to make a quick buck while times are tough for people are going to move in. But hopefully when the economy improves, that's when I'm interested in what's going to happen to these high streets.
You might be waiting quite a long time for the economy to improve in that way. I mean, if you look at what has actually happened on the high street over the last 5 years, I mean, since the onset of the recession, retail administrations UK-wide have cost about 198,000 jobs. When the economy picks up, if the economy picks up, the damage and the change is going to have been quite extensive. So we actually need to be thinking now about different uses, about rethinking the high street in different ways that are relevant and able to face future challenges.
And how do we do that then, Julian? Because obviously we can't stop these
I think you have to
shops setting up.
Yeah, you have to have local government involved. You have to have central government involved to an extent. And I think that's where government acts as a steward of place. They have an interest in the success of places. And I think simply to say, let the market sort itself out, let the weak go to the wall, actually is hugely damaging for places that people live in.
But what is it exactly that you want? Because you've heard from Walaa that she doesn't want government intervention, but if you do, what do you want them to do?
Okay. I think, you need positive planning by local government so that instead of simply buying into the idea that you regenerate a town by putting in extra retail space and building a new mall, you think more creatively about the kind of activities that you want there. You need some high streets. You're going to need to say, actually, you want to change some of the uses there back to residential, back to the kind of residential activities that you used to have in some of those places. You need to think about what is the viable core of a particular town or city. How can it have a mix of uses that is going to attract people in, cultural, leisure uses, things that make place somewhere where people want to live.
Sure, Julian, we'll take those top two that you've mentioned already, the planning and the residential activity, and we'll go to Andrew Harrison.
I'd absolutely agree there. I mean, looking before the recession, I think the complaint everyone had was that every town centre had become the same. It was the same old shops, Boots, Holland and Barrett. Actually, HMV was one of them. So we got to a point where, what's the point in visiting the centre of your local town? It's going to be the same as every other place you've been to. I would like to think that when we get through this recession, we'll be able to perhaps shepherd town centres towards having a bit of diversity, a bit of variety there, so that there is a point in travelling out of your normal area. That can be driven by planning permission, by perhaps a bit more of a local approach to what makes a characterful high street, rather than, as you say, just opening up a load of boxes saying fill this with whatever market forces determines.
Absolutely, I agree with you there, and I think that's an area where street markets and places for start-up businesses can actually be really important, because that encourages local innovation, offer cheap, easy access accommodation that people can move into, try stuff out and see if it will work.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. Joining me for today's discussion is Andrew Harrison, the editor of Q Magazine. Walaa Idris is a political activist. Mark Thompson is a Lib Dem blogger. And Julian Dobson is an urban regeneration specialist. Mark Thompson.
I think that I wasn't saying that there is no role at all for government or local council. I accept that obviously they have to set certain parameters, but I think the idea that they can control and decide what's going to happen with these town centres is unrealistic. I think what will happen is what people ultimately want to happen, as in, when you talk about the market deciding, what you're actually talking about is millions and millions of people all around the country deciding what they want. I mean, a nice example of the sort of thing that Andrew was just talking about, lots of little independent shops. I go down to Brighton a fair bit, and in the lanes in Brighton there are loads and loads of wonderful independent shops. I think in the lanes there are hardly any chains at all, apart from maybe the odd coffee shop. And that's a great shopping experience. But of course, people obviously like to go and see that. And if people wanted to go and have that kind of experience in other towns, then eventually maybe what will replace, the empty shops that we're seeing at the moment are shops like that. But it's going to have to be what people want.
And it's also going to...
Sure, let Andrew carry on a second, Julian.
That's very interesting, because I live in Stoke Newington, which is the Brighton of North London, which is full of little shops like that. And at the moment, there is a great deal of controversy about a giant Sainsbury's coming in, which will cause terrible problems for the very well-established, marvellous, high-quality Turkish and Kurdish corner shops, which give the place its character. So at one level, a gigantic shop comes in, of course it brings jobs. Well, what's it going to do to the character of the area? Is it going to turn it into just another place? Is it going to remove the reason why people want to come to Stoke Newington in the first place?
Walaa Idris, what are your thoughts?
Well, I still stand by my let the government meddle as little as possible, but I take Julian's point in the city centres having their own character and their own identity.
But we can get this from local people coming together, as we heard from Andrew.
Exactly.
We might see it in Brighton. We've seen it in places like Totnes when they throw out the Costa, or Costa agreed to go away.
And that's organic, and that's normal, and that's organic, and that's the way, and that's, for me, is the market deciding, which as Mark said, it's the people.
That's local people.
It's the people, but local people are the market, aren't they?
And that's true. And if local people want to Sainsbury's,
it's incredibly hard for local people to repel a large incoming retailer. It's incredibly difficult.
Well, a lot of time local people want that retailer to come, come and to save them the trip somewhere else,
sure,
and to give them everything fresh and at a low cost. I mean, the way we are, we sometimes sit there and pretend we not enjoy. I mean, if I sit here and say to you, well, yeah, I mourn HMV and I mourn the loss of Jessops and all this, I buy from Amazon, I download from iTunes, and I'm going to be a liar if I say I don't, have my grocery delivered to me by Sainsbury's.
Well, don't you like to have the choice as well? Don't you like to have the options to do these other things?
I'm realistic enough to say, am I out there making that choice happen for everyone else, or am I taking the easy route, rather spend time doing other things and put my shopping and my hassle, of finding a parking space and all that, and bringing the shopping up to...
This is all absolutely true, and I wouldn't argue with it. However, we could be in the paradoxical situation of consumer choice, individual consumer choice, reducing consumer choice. What happens when there's nowhere left to buy your music from but Amazon, and nowhere else left to buy your groceries from but Sainsbury's?
Let the consumer decide. It's at the end of the day, it's the consumers.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that simple, is it?
I think
it's
you're painting a slightly dystopianistic picture there, though, Andrew, of a future where we only have Amazon and we only have huge supermarket chains. No, I think what will happen. I think things happen in cycles, and I think what will happen is that if we end up in a situation where certain parts of the country, or the country generally, just has predominantly these large shops, and people start to get really annoyed with them and they want smaller shops, then the smaller shops will come because people want them.
I'd love to believe you.
But if you look at the UK today, there are parts in the UK where the high street shops are literally dying or turning into Cafe Costa and Starbucks, and that's about it. And there are parts in the country where you still have those quintessentially small little shops. We have different flavors in the country, and that's what makes the whole country so unique.
On that lovely cultural note, we're going to have to end today's discussion. Well, thank you so much to all of my guests. Andrew Harrison, the editor of Q Magazine, Mark Thompson, the Lib Dem blogger, Walaa Idris, the political activist, and Julian Dobson, specialising in urban regeneration.